Today, it is my honor and privilege to welcome Mr. Tom Henricks to the channel today. He is an extremely accomplished person in so many realms, not just in the space program, but he is a 4-time astronaut. He flew 2 missions in the space shuttle as a pilot and 2 additional missions as a commander. He has flown F-16s, F-4s. He's got hundreds of skydives on his record. He is the person to talk to about this, and so it's my honor to welcome him to the channel today. Tom, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. Looking forward to it.
So let's get right into your time in space. One of the things I've always wanted to be able to ask an astronaut is about the launch process, and specifically, when I watched the last SpaceX launch a couple times, because they had to try a few times before they were able to actually launch. That moment of being strapped in and waiting. I got to know what's going through your head, emotionally, mentally, when you're strapped in for sometimes hours, waiting to go. What on earth is going through your head at that moment?
So there's really kind of a build up to that point. So you go into quarantine. Astronauts go into quarantine, which means they don't want to come close to them. It's like being quarantined for COVID. They didn't want us to go into space with any bugs, any viruses. So we would quarantine ourselves for a week before a launch. The last 3 days of that, we would be down at the Kennedy Space Center with very little to do except to wait for the launch. That's when you start worrying, because you've been so busy getting ready to go that you never had time to think about it. But then 3 days before the launch, you go down to Florida, you see this gigantic vehicle on the launch pad, and it finally hits you. They're going to ask me to get on that thing.
I got to get in that.
This is going to be where I'm at in 3 days. And that's when you have the thoughts about, do I have my things in order? Have I said what I wanted to say to everybody I love? And you have the nightmares. But when you go out to the launch pad to get to the answer to your question, that's when you get the game face on. That's when the training kicks in, even though as a commander, we were in the first one in and had about 2 hours to wait till we launched. You went through all the checklists. You made jokes about the doctor because the doctor was the only one on the intercom outside the crew. And you tried to keep everyone light and relaxed while everyone finished being strapped in. And then as the countdown gets closer to launch, there's a period where you have a hard time staying awake because the crew that helped you strap in has all left. They're going through all the checks to make sure the shuttle's buttoned up. There's a lot of chatter in the background between mission control and all the engineers. But in the cockpit, there's really nothing to do for about an hour. And you struggle to stay awake. And a lot of us have to get a little nap in then. But once we hit the 9-minute hold, when you come out of that, they have already pulled everyone involved to give a thumbs up or a go for launch. When you come out of that hold, it is game on. You're focused. And when the solid rocket boosters light, the entire vehicle lurches. This is a 4.5 million pound vehicle that lurches. And you just pray that you're going to go up because something behind you just exploded. And when you come off the pad, in less than a minute, you're going supersonic. You burn propellants at the rate of 12 tons a second, and you're on the way to space.
It's hard to believe. Let's go back for a second. So it's such the opposite of what I would have expected you to say, that those moments in the hour strapped in, you're taking a nap. It's hard to stay awake. I never would have thought that. I would have thought it's the opposite. What do you attribute that to? Is that attributed to your training? Is it because you've been there before?
Part of it is, as test pilots, of course, we had taken some risk. And you realize once you're strapped in, you've already accepted that risk. There's nothing you're going to do except be prepared so you don't create any risk. And if you're confident that you're ready to go, relax.
I have nothing else really to do.
Right.
So you mentioned something kind of talking about your crew and kind of keeping them calm. So did this moment and kind of the build up to launch, did it change much from you, launch number 1 to 4, the things that are kind of going through your head and your demeanor and your responsibilities when you're strapped in waiting to go? What did that look like?
Great question. Great question. My first launch was a night launch a couple years after the Challenger accident. So that was a whole different experience, especially for the family, because all the families were aware of the risk at that time. So the calmness was part of it, and as the pilot and commander, you don't want to be up there nervous and making the rest of the crew uncomfortable. So it's professional. But the first launch was a night launch, and the simulators didn't prepare me for that. They just didn't do the solid booster separation justice because you're in a fireball. And remember, this is a few years after Challenger, and 2 minutes into the flight, we're in a fireball. That was kind of a heart stopper. Seeing the Earth for the first time with the full moon rising, I'll never forget that. It was like a Star Trek experience. My second mission was with a German crew. We had 2 Germans on board. As the main engine started, as you know, the shuttle had 3 main engines on the back, and they start 6 seconds before the boosters light. Well, the third one had a valve failure and shut down the engines. So for about the next 2 minutes, we were rocking back and forth because those engines, when they build up thrust, they're bending the solid rocket boosters. And in a normal launch, when the flexion comes back to vertical, you launch. But if the engine shut off, we twanged for about 2 minutes. So that was unique for that mission. The third mission was the one where we had the woodpeckers attack the external tank. About a month.
Like a bird, like woodpeckers?
Yes, literally. If you recall, the external, I'll use a prop here. So the coating on this external tank is about the consistency of styrofoam, and it's 3 or 4 inches thick. So the woodpecker was pecking through there to make a nest, and he'd hit aluminum and moved to a different spot. So he ruined the insulation around that external tank. We had to cancel the launch, roll the entire stack back in and fix it.
Ask, so are there any new protocols or funky checklist now items in NASA for woodpeckers?
Yes, they put up bird prevention.
Okay.
So they have to be careful because it's a bird sanctuary. So you can't go around harvesting the birds. They just had to tease the birds into going somewhere else to nest rather than the external tank.
So all those funny regulations are always there for a reason. So
right,
you have to ask where that came from.
Just like with any type of flying.
So what about your third and fourth launch?
Well, so the third one went smoothly after we fixed the woodpecker problem, and that was. And by the way, you mentioned I think something about launches. Normally, 1 in 3 will go as scheduled. So when I invited guests down to watch a launch, I always told them that there was only 1 in 3 chances that they see us launch on time. So go have a vacation and hopefully you see a SpaceX or a Space Shuttle launch. Fourth mission was unique because we had an Italian and a Spaniard as backups, and we had a Frenchman and a Canadian on the crew. So it was very international atmosphere. That countdown went smoothly, and we launched and spent 18 days in space.
Wow.
And the unique thing on that mission was they gave us a lipstick lens camera, primarily just to show for the first time what it was like for the crew to get on board the shuttle live. Well, we figured out how to make that live link recordable during launch. So although we couldn't downlink it live, we recorded the entire launch from inside the cockpit for the first time and downlink that. That was exciting.
That's awesome. So let's go back a little bit. I don't want to miss this. I really want to hear your version of it. Talking about the actual launch and saying you're getting, you can tell something just blew up essentially behind you. Just kind of walk us through the few minutes of actually getting to orbit. What is that like?
Sure. So when the solid boosters light, especially if it's your first flight, we would tell each other, I left half my brain on the launch pad. Because as you know, one of the first things they teach you as a pilot is to stay ahead of the airplane. Well, when the airplane goes supersonic in 55 seconds, climbing at 7 degrees angle and 8.5 minutes you're in space going Mach 25, it's really a challenge to stay ahead of the bird. And I would admit, I left half my brain on the launch pad that first night launch. I did remember to look out the window, but by the fourth mission, which was within a 5-year span, I was comfortable with it. I was able to stay ahead of the bird, anticipated all the motions, sounds, and sensations like you would in any other airplane. You get the feel for it. And the attitude I took as a commander, because you have to be able to take control anytime after 2 minutes in flight or take emergency action at any point in the flight, and you have to be confident enough to do that. So just like any other airplane, I mentally had to strap the shuttle on. I couldn't just get in and let somebody else attach me to the shuttle. I had to strap that vehicle on, and that's how I overcame that challenge. And I recommend that to any pilot. You've got to become confident and comfortable enough in your airplane that you strap that baby on.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I was actually filming a video last week, and that's an expression I often use, especially on mornings when you get to go fly down a river or down a canyon. It really feels like you set on your own set of wings. Right. And I never thought I would have heard an astronaut explain it the same way about the shuttle. That's great. So you talked about some surprises, on the launch pad or things getting rescheduled. What about in space? What kind of surprises or difficulties did you encounter that people back on Earth or even watching it broadcast on TV just don't have an appreciation for? What kind of things would you run into?
So every mission, and currently on the space station, things break. They're machines, things break down, hardware, software. Well, the pilots on board the shuttle were the mechanics. You can't call for somebody to come up and help you. You can coordinate with the folks on the ground, but to do the actual repairs were done by the pilots. So one of the major ones I did was fix the toilet on one of the missions. We had a wastewater tank. It wasn't really a toilet. Fix the wastewater tank and repair that, and it took me back to my farm days, because once I sealed up the plumbing that I had to redo, they said, well, we'll have to put pressure on it and watch the pressure bleed down for hours before we can let you use the toilet. Well, I said, well, how about if I just use a saliva test like you would on a tire? And it took them a few minutes, and they understood what I meant. They said, sure, try the saliva test. No bubbles, open the toilet. But the strange things that I think a lot of people don't appreciate is how difficult it is sleeping in space, because you're floating. So you don't have the comfort of lying on a mattress. You don't have the comfort of your head being on a pillow or the blankets being on top of you. You're just floating. So to compensate for that, we would strap a pillow to our head with Velcro, just a cushion. And if you had it on your forehead, you'd be lying on your stomach. And if you want to roll over, you just rotate that pad, and that's how you rolled over. So sleeping was a real challenge. To get 3 hours of sleep was a good night's sleep for me, and that's really not enough. So we had sleeping aids that we could use to get a good night's sleep before we returned.
Did you wake up wondering where you were?
No. The other thing was we would test those sleeping aids in our homes before we left. That was normal procedure. So you knew which sleeping tablets would allow you to wake up and function if you had to wake up in the middle of the night. So that was good. Going to the restroom is always a common question. The short answer is you go very carefully. Without gravity, there's nothing pulling anything into a funnel or a volume. So we have to use suction to collect the liquid waste. And the solid waste was similarly captured by suction through a small container. Of course, the solid waste is compacted and brought back. The liquid waste is dumped out into space and sublimates. The other interesting thing is dreams. So when we would dream, myself, when I would dream, and many were the same, on Earth, we dreamt about going to space. In space, everyone dreamed about being on Earth.
No kidding.
I thought that was interesting.
And you wake up and say, well, I'm not only in space, but I'm over Italy, or I'm over. Would you wake up in the morning and see what part of the Earth you were over?
Well, that was always a challenge, even in the middle of the day, because we're going around the Earth every 90 minutes. We're traveling 5 miles a second. So there's not a lot of dwell time over a piece of ground. So we relied on the laptop to tell us what part of the Earth we were over, and then we could narrow down geographic references. Airports are great references because of the runway patterns. But we never got tired of looking out the window, because as we're going around every 90 minutes, the Earth was rotating underneath us. So every time we came around, we saw a new part of the Earth. So it never got boring. Back to the sleep thing. So you always have something to look out the window. How do you stop people? Well, as a commander, my technique was when it was time to get 6 hours of sleep, we covered the windows. And that made everyone focus, at least internally. And then I didn't allow a window cover to come off until we were woken up, which is typically done by a radio call playing music from Mission Control. And that's when we would open the window covers again.
It's such an interesting contrast that you have incredible technology that got you to space in the first place, but the challenges that you're referencing here are everyday things. It's fixing the toilet, right? Which
Right.
now you have to at home. You don't have any excuse. If you can fix the toilet on the space shuttle, you can fix the one at home. So
I hope my wife doesn't hear this.
you probably don't get I don't have an excuse to call the plumber, but getting good sleep, all these things, that's interesting contrast. Well, let's talk about the claustrophobia at all. Was that ever an issue in the shuttle? And then kind of how does NASA test you for that? How do they look out for that in advance?
Okay, well, let me answer the first part of that initially. During the screening process, to test us for claustrophobia, they put us in a round sphere, and the sphere was actually designed to allow an astronaut in a spacesuit to take other crew members in these spheres from one vehicle that's malfunctioned to a rescue vehicle. That was never used, but the theory was still a possibility.
In space, as a spacewalk. Okay.
Yes. So because of that, they test this in those spheres. So imagine you got your socks and shorts and t-shirt on, and they put you in a beach ball size sphere, zip it up, have a mic on you, there's no lights in there, and they don't tell you how long you're going to be in there. So they're just listening to your breathing, and when you relax, they let you out.
Wow.
That's how they test this for claustrophobia.
No more context than that. It's just, hey, get in here, and we're going to listen to you for a little bit.
Right.
Wow.
And the only time I've ever experienced claustrophobia in my life was on the space shuttle. And that's unusual because without gravity, the volume essentially doubles because you're not stuck to the floor. Mm-hmm. And you can have people hanging from the ceiling or floating from the ceiling, and it doesn't seem any more crowded by doubling the number of people. Mm-hmm. But we had sleep bunks. They're sleep stations. They're stacked along one of the walls of the shuttle, and one of them on the bottom was the smallest one. And on my third mission, they were testing sound insulation, soundproofing inside that. So they had a coating of material around it, which made the volume smaller, and in my mind, made it look like a coffin. I spent one night in there, and I couldn't sleep until I cracked the door open. That's the only time I've been claustrophobic.
So you said your room in the cabin kind of doubles effectively once you get into a zero gravity environment. Are you still kind of bumping elbows with everybody? Do you feel like you have a lot of space? How does that kind of change throughout the mission?
So there's two different configurations that I've flown in that are available in the shuttle, assuming you're not going to a space station. So if you're just going to work in the shuttle, you have the cockpit, which is about the size of a DC-10 or 777 cockpit, roughly that size. And we have 4 people there for launch and landing. We take the 2 rear seats out once we're in space, so that volume is available. And then immediately below that is what we call the mid-deck, and that has seats for launch and landing that are also taken down during orbit. So that gives enough volume where 5 people can work comfortably in that, and you're going to have to share the space, but you're not elbow to elbow. And because of the lack of gravity, you can actually get separated because somebody might be working with their feet on the floor and somebody else has got their belly up against the ceiling looking out the window taking pictures. And again, zero gravity makes the volume much more useful and less crowded. It's really roomy when we carry the lab, which we did on 2 of my missions. The lab was put in the payload bay where normally you might have a satellite, and the laboratory is about the same size as a city bus. So that was a great place for 80 experiments and a large volume that you could exercise in, actually play in, and we could do tumbling. It had a tunnel that connected that with the mid-deck, and you could float down the tunnel. So those 2 configurations made it enough that in the roomy configuration with the lab, 18 days was very easy to do. My crew could have spent another week comfortably. In the shuttle part of it, just the cab and the cockpit and the mid-deck, probably 10 days is enough, and you're ready to come home.
Ready to get home.
Yeah.
So when you first get to space, is there any time built into the mission? This might sound immature, but it's only because I've never been to space. Is there moments built in there to kind of have just the gleeful expression of, I'm in space, I'm weightless, I'm just, but before you kind of get to work, is there a few moments built in there just to kind of take it in? Or is it, hey, as soon as you launch, I mean, you're right to the checklist and you're working?
It's a very insightful question. So the bottom line is NASA does not build in any free time, especially when you first get to space. It's extremely busy because you have to reconfigure from being a rocket to being a satellite. So all the things that you had set up that were allowing you to safely launch under all those G's with the suits on, now you got to get rid of all that stuff so you can go to work in space. Especially if you're going to deploy a satellite, we try to do that the first day because that's the reason you went, and you want to get that thing out in case you have to return. So the first day, you don't get a break until they say it's time to go to sleep and they stop talking to you. That's when your fun time starts.
That's when you have the moment of...
But the best days as a crew member in space were the days when you were prepared to re-enter. Typically, they're trying to get you into the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and you would pray for the weather to be bad, because that meant another day in space.
You got some free time.
With free time. That's when we broke out the music and just hung by the windows and got the cameras out and took pictures of, we could always take a few personal items. And you'd use that free time to, show your loved one, you might have flown a watch or a ring for them, take that picture with the Earth in the background. Wow. That's when you did all that stuff.
Because I've got to imagine, especially, for your missions as a commander, I imagine you flew with some people that it was their first time in space.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're expecting them to kind of get to work, they can't act like they've been there before because they've never been there, right? So they don't get that moment of, hey, let's just take this in for a second. It's right to work.
Okay, so one of the major problems of space travel is space adaptation syndrome. So about a third of the folks on your crew typically are vomiting the first day. And another third aren't feeling 100% because they don't feel well.
So that's their gleeful moment of I'm in space.
Well, so NASA understands that. They've learned that from the Mercury and Apollo days, that you can't rely on the human to be 100% the first day. So they timed our tasks during training, and they doubled that time for the first day. And they added about 50% to it for the second day, so you weren't really working full speed until the third day.
Mm-hmm. Well, because you're up there doing tests and doing missions, but your experience in space is probably just as much a test as all the other experiments you're running, right? Because they're seeing how things are impacting you and how you perform and things they can learn for the future, right?
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So we weren't allowed to do tests on primates other than humans. So,
go figure.
So yes, the advantage of being a pilot, though, is they couldn't do anything invasive because they needed the pilots to be healthy for the landing. But on my last mission, we had 5 guinea pigs, and they were drawing blood twice a day, every day.
So you mentioned re-entry and praying for bad weather. I'll keep that in mind when things are delayed in the future for when I'm watching other missions. But flying the space shuttle, if we're sitting in front of some airplanes here, it's probably pretty difficult to liken that to flying a 182 or a Super Cub. But if you had to kind of describe, it's like this airplane if you changed what? I mean, how do you try to explain to other pilots and non-pilots what flying a gliding space shuttle is like?
It is unique, but I would say it's similar to doing a 20-degree dive bomb pass in a fighter in landing. Instead of dropping a weapon, you do the 20-degree dive and just land on a runway. That's how dynamic it is. But you're flying a 737 size vehicle that weighs 110 tons with no way to go around. So the training is critical there. Each commander has at least 1,200 practice landings in the shuttle training aircraft, the modified Gulfstream, before we would let them command.
1,200. Right. Wow. So what's plan B in that scenario? Being long seems easier to correct for than being short, but what are some of your kind of contingencies when you're coming back in?
So we have prepared landing sites during the launch phase. For example, if we lose an engine during liftoff and we can't make it back to Florida, we would go to Europe or Africa. But we don't do that for landing. If we're going to overshoot, there's a small chance we can make it to Puerto Rico or something downrange. If we're going to be short, there might be Dyess, Texas, but those were extremely unlikely scenarios. If you couldn't get to the runway, the most likely scenario was bailing out. And we would make that decision, commander's decision, to bail out. And once we got below 40,000 feet, one of the mission specialists on the middeck could blow the hatch. The same hatch that we climb in through can be jettisoned and then there was a pole that extended out that hatch, and you connected your parachute harness to that pole, and that would allow you to slide under the wing, and your parachute allowed you to reach the ground safely.
You know, now that you've been to space 4 times, I think this is the most important question I want to ask you is, how's your perspective changed now being back on Earth?
The common experiences that we all share that have been to space is that there are no political borders visible from space. And yet we're still teaching students geography on maps that have borders on them. So one of the interesting things was when we first got to space, trying to identify geographic features that we were taught on maps with a political border was much more challenging because the political borders aren't there. You know, they're man-made or artificial. So we shouldn't be teaching geography with political borders on them. Every leader in the world should go to space because you get the perspective that we are one human race surviving on a spaceship called Earth. And we have that shared experience. I'm not sure if we're alone in the universe, but we're sure alone in this solar system, and we need to take care of the spaceship we're living on.
Next week, I'm posting part 2 of the interview where Tom discusses what it's like to land the shuttle by hand from space. And it is amazing to hear his description of it. And when that's posted, it'll be on the screen, and I'll see you there.